We've been looking at the stages of contemplation as described in the work of quite a large contributor to the Philokalia, Peter of Damascus, probably a 10th or 11th century Eastern Christian monk. And yesterday we looked at the first three stages, where he deals with the ascetical aspects of the journey into contemplation. And we saw how we have to face what the Buddhists would call the dukkha, or the unsatisfactoriness, or the fallenness of the world, the fact that things don't always work as we would like them to, in fact very often don't. And at the same time, as we learn to accept that and understand that and not run away from it, we can develop a sense of responsibility, a personal decision arising from a deeper level of volition. It's not just a New Year's resolution which we forget in 5 minutes, but a deeper volition or a deeper change, in fact, within ourselves that allows us to do something about it, to actually set about climbing out of what can, in its worst forms, really be a hell, or an experience of isolation and deprivation and lovelessness, so that we can do something about it. And that's the work of faith on our part. A certain amount of effort is needed. We're not passive passengers on this journey into contemplation, but we have to make some effort. We have to want to make the journey, but as soon as we do, we are the beneficiaries of a response that we experience, as Peter says, God's attentive gaze, and it's that gaze which then pulls us forward and pulls us into the next stages. So this morning I'd like to look at the fourth stage of contemplation, which for him is really the beginning of the journey. This is where you've got over your worst problems. You've taken the first step on the 12-step program. You've admitted that you can't do it all by yourself, and you, in that particular case, kick the habit, and you realize that the fellowship and the friendship of others is essential to this, but also grace comes into the equation as well. So it's now that we could say we are really beginning. John Main, in describing the stages of meditation, you could say meditation is the way we accept or receive the gift of contemplation. In the Christian understanding, this process of contemplation, or the vision of God is what it means, is essentially gratuitous. It's not something we acquire through a technique or a massive effort of will, although we have to do something about it ourselves, as I said, otherwise we don't get off our chairs. But essentially, this experience manifests grace, something free, something absolutely unconditioned by cause and effect even, and yet it's something we attune ourselves to, something of a paradox, because it might look or sound as if we're twisting God's arm in some way, or we're finding some metaphysical or cosmic technique that's going to make it happen, because we do have to do something. But essentially, the experience itself and even the process itself, because the experience is a process, not just getting to our destination and then unpacking our bags and settling down, as we've all done here this week, But the experience itself is a process. And in the literature, especially of the Eastern Fathers of the Church, we see that it is an infinite process. If we seek God, St. Gregory of Nyssa says, we will find God. Simple as that. Just seek and you will find. But then he says, to find is to seek. When you've found, you've just kind of discovered another infinity, another sphere beyond, another horizon beyond what you thought was your goal. So the seeking leads to finding, that's good news. The finding always opens up into a new boundlessness, a new infinity. So Gregory of Nyssa says there are infinite degrees of perfection, which is why we shouldn't be trapped by perfectionism. Because perfectionism thinks that there's only one kind of perfection, and if I can do this and achieve that and master this and control that, then I've become perfect. So that's why perfectionism, in religious people especially, is really counterproductive. It really trips you up. It really blocks the experience of God. This is what Jesus points out many times in his critique of religion, the religion of his own age, but it's inherent in all religious people and institutions especially, this tendency to reduce perfection to something, to one horizon, as it were. So, with the fourth stage of contemplation, the journey of contemplation really begins. Father John says that when we're learning to meditate, it's when, in this way of meditation, when we start listening to the mantra, we can say that meditation is really beginning. Because again, we don't want to take this too literally or in too much of a linear way, but when we begin to meditate, our minds are very scattered. We begin perhaps even with some serious problems, as Peter was describing yesterday. We've fallen into the fallenness of the world, into the fallenness of our own ego, into the darkness, even of serious problems, psychological, psychic problems. So if we begin to meditate in that state, we are going to find it pretty rough at times. I mentioned yesterday the man who meditated for the first time and discovered in a wonderful, immediate and pure way that he has peace and joy in himself. And he wasn't looking for it, he had no idea. He didn't have any demands or expectations, which is perhaps why he found it so quickly. But he just fell into it, and I'm sure it's changed his life. He just discovered that it's there. Perhaps it's going to take him another 20 years to act on it. But when we begin, in the early stages, we will find ourselves battling with our restless, distracted minds that are constantly programmed to spin back to ourselves, to some kind of self-centeredness or self-reflection or self-analysis. And the ego system is so deeply ingrained, of course, that it takes a bit of training even to begin to turn the searchlight of consciousness off ourselves. But then he says, so we start saying the mantra with constant interruptions. And then perhaps we notice after some time that we are able to say the mantra with greater attention for longer periods of time before we drift off into our thoughts and distractions. And but then he says that there come times, come periods, levels where you can say the mantra with complete attention, and you're listening to the word as you say it. He says this is where you could say your meditation is really beginning, because we're out of this first stage of self-fixation and serious distraction, and we're moving into another stage where our attention can really be other-centered. So that's why we could say it's beginning. So this is the fourth stage in Peter of Damascus's 8 stages. And he begins in a surprising way. I mean, in looking at the fourth stage of contemplation, we'll see what he thinks about the mystery of Christ, the practice of detachment, and the experience of love. This is how he begins. The fourth stage of contemplation consists in the understanding of our Lord's incarnation and his manner of life in this world, to the point that we practically forget even to eat. This, according to St. John Climacus, is what happened to King David when his mind was wrapped in ecstasy at God's marvels. So he uses the word understanding, our Lord's incarnation and his manner of life, but this is a different kind of understanding than perhaps what we were working on yesterday when we reflected in the Lectio and in the discussion in the evening about that passage from the Gospel of John. There we were trying to understand, but we were not yet, I think, at this kind of understanding where we were so wrapped in the wonder of it that we suddenly looked at our watches and saw that we'd missed the boat or back to town or our evening meal. So there are different levels of understanding, and he's talking about a level of understanding in which we behold with our intellect. This is the word is translated as intellect, but it's not what we would normally think of as intellectual knowledge. Intellect would be the higher mind, where consciousness focuses or comes to understanding at an integrative level. Perhaps we might say beyond the subject-object divide. So we're not looking at the words of the Gospel, for example. In this section, Peter's concentrating, as we were yesterday, as we will later today, on the Scriptures. So we'll have to come back to this question of Scriptures, how we read the Scriptures and what the Scriptures mean, or potentially what they are for us as a means. He never says they're an end in themselves, but what the Scriptures mean as means to us. And it's with the eye of the heart, we might say, or with the intellect, as he would be translated, that we can read the deeper meanings of the Scriptures and be taught by them. Meditation is, in this sense, and in his language, an ascetical practice. Remember, ascesis, the first 3 stages of his journey into contemplation, which don't stop once you move to the 4th stage, necessarily. Some of those activities in the first three stages, some of those practices, ascetical practices, training practices, remain useful, and you keep them going. But meditation, we could say, is an ascetical practice. That's different from meditating just to reduce your blood pressure or your cholesterol, which are perfectly good reasons to meditate and effective. But if we approach meditation, as we might say, as a spiritual practice, and there is a discipline rather than a technique involved, then this is part of our training, it's part of our daily exercise, it's part of the way we look after ourselves, and we're concerned about eating healthily, living a well-balanced life, doing the right amount of physical exercise. So all of those are ascetical practices. You say, no, I've had enough, thank you. You know, I've had enough potatoes, I've had enough wine for tonight, whatever it is. So that principle of moderation and control, self-control, one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit is self-control, according to St. Paul. Those are what constitute this ascetical element or aspect of our lives. So meditation maybe has different levels of meaning, of course, but it's certainly also an ascetical practice. So through the practice of meditation, we come to this deeper insight, we might say, but better than the word understanding, of the incarnation and the meaning of Christ. And Peter says that once we have received knowledge of these things, and of the mysteries hidden in the Gospels, we will never lose our longing, or cease from shedding tears that come to us unbidden. Now again, as I said before, this is language that we have to unpack a lot for our own time. First of all, he's speaking about receiving knowledge. So this isn't just a question of thinking about or speaking about. The thinking, the reading, the reflection, the conversation are important aspects or stages of our coming to understanding, of our, we might say, deepening our faith. But in the end, this knowledge, which is a saving knowledge, this healing knowledge, this knowledge is received. It comes as grace, as something gratuitous. But we prepare ourselves to receive it. So we could say, for example, meditation is the way we prepare ourselves to receive the grace of contemplation. St. Teresa said that all we can do in this life, in prayer, is to dispose ourselves, is to get ready, to prepare ourselves. So once we have received knowledge of these things, and of the mysteries hidden in the Gospels, so there are things hidden in the Gospels. We spoke yesterday a little bit about this metaphor of hiding things. You find it in quite a few Sufi poems, and in many folk tales too. That if you want to hide something, for one reason or another, you hide it in the most obvious place, because that's not where people look. And in many of the scriptures or spiritual writings, you'll find that God has hidden himself in the human heart. It's the last place we expect to find him. So we go looking to the ends of the earth, we look in the mysteries of science, we by the world's greatest philosophers, we study, we explore, we look into every possible avenue of knowledge, and all the time it's there at home. Many folk tales, of course, say the same thing. A treasure is hidden somewhere. The person starts to go out on a long trip to find it, travels all around the world, and then finally picks up the clue that the treasure is buried under his fireplace at home. So coming home, many people experience that as the meaning of their spiritual journey. Many people will say, as soon as I started meditating, I felt I was coming home. And they often just say coming home. It's not coming home to myself even, although that's part of it, but just coming home. So these things are hidden mysteries. Mysteries are things that we know exist, like the dark energy in the universe. We know that most of the universe, I think, is supposed to be made up of this form of energy that we know nothing about. It's a mystery. We know it exists. One day we will, probably, if we don't destroy ourselves beforehand, we will find out what it is. But the mysteries that he's speaking about, in a similar way, are things that we know about, but we cannot conceptualize or explain. But these mysteries we can actually experience. They are truths that we feel and perceive, even though the mind cannot really grasp them. And as soon as we become aware of that level of knowledge, the spiritual knowledge, our life begins to change. You can see it in people. While we're living at that level of, totally pragmatic, rationalistic knowledge where everything can be verified, measured, and so on, that affects the way you live. It affects the way you relate to other people. And I think it often, not always, but it often creates a tendency to a kind of cynicism, or even to a kind of manipulation of other people. There's a limitation to it in human terms. But very often you'll meet the same person after they have had some life-changing experience, or they've begun to meditate, or something has just shaken them out of that scientism, that rationalism, and they just seem much gentler. They seem more human, more open to wonder. And this wonder is a very important part of what Peter is going to speak about. So it's a different kind of knowledge that has just dawned upon them. And this is the beginning of the knowledge that he's speaking about here. So this is what he calls acquiring direct spiritual knowledge. It's not the knowledge that comes through discussion, or through reading, or through our own intellectual analysis, or comparison of different authorities, of different thinkers. All of that has its value, but but this isn't the knowledge that he's speaking about. Direct spiritual knowledge. And when we truly perceive God's marvels, we are truly beside ourselves. We experience a certain level of ecstasy. Ecstasy doesn't mean always that we are intoxicated or overwhelmed or out of control. It means that we literally stand outside. But what we're standing outside, ecstasis, to stand outside, really means to stand outside the subject-object duality. So there's a paradox there, because you're standing outside being outside. You're standing outside of the inner and the outer division. And it's standing outside of this that gives us the feeling of, now I see. That's clear. Now I feel at home. It's the right relation, or the true perception, in relation to reality around us. And he says, when this happens, or as it happens, this is pleasurable, this is delightful, this is what we are meant for, and we feel that we are becoming the person we have the potential to be. We're not, as I think I mentioned yesterday, that neuroscientist I heard giving his view of human nature, that basically human beings are, what was it? Emotional egoists, anyway. Amoral emotional egoists, yes, thank you. And well, that may be a good definition of a 3-month-old baby. You don't blame the baby for being egotistical or amoral or very emotional about what it wants or doesn't, or what it gets. But that's it's a rather unsentimental way of describing a child. But it's not, hopefully, where we stay. I think if you get stuck at that level of your development, you might end up as a dictator. Dictators are pretty amoral, pretty emotional, and certainly very egocentric. And probably, although they can act in a terrible way, they are really very childish, infantile. But normally, that's not how we would define human beings. We see human beings as people who are evolving and growing and becoming more than that. So as we move along these stages, we can have experiences of this kind, glimpses of this kind, but often they don't last very long. And we do remember that it's time to eat, or time to get the ferry, or time to pay the telephone bill. So, she says, most of us are slightly stirred by the scriptures, but again soon plunged into darkness by laziness, forgetfulness, or ignorance. Remember how these first 3 stages of the ascetical journey described yesterday are the really negative force in them that can overwhelm us is ignorance. But if we continue on the learning process, we are purified by passion. Purified of our passions. Remember, passions are disordered emotions, or are, like an addiction is a passion in this language. Passion doesn't mean intensity; it means disordered state, dysfunctional state of mind. So we are purified of passions by inward grief. And again, that's something we need to understand. Remember what he says about the gift of tears. This natural expelling of the toxins of our psyche, finding expression sometimes in a physical manifestation like that. In fact, I think the chemical composition of tears is toxins actually coming out of the body, as far as I remember. And then, as this process of purification continues, we perceive the hidden mysteries in all the scriptures and are astonished by them all, especially those of the Gospels. And as this happens, what is difficult becomes easy, and we are gradually deified by this knowledge. So it's a process. From one perspective, it's a gradual process. From another one, you might be amazed at how far you've changed, how much you've changed in the last year or 2 years or 3 years. But from within the process, it might seem gradual. What is difficult becomes easy. I think this is, I don't think people would ever say meditation is easy, but the practice becomes easier in the sense that you don't have to fight your, tendencies to skip the meditation or to skip the practice. It becomes more integrated and part of your life, for example. So it really was difficult to find time for meditation before. So did I tell you about the IMF man yesterday? No. Right. I had said it before, but not yesterday. He invited one of our meditators in Washington, who's very high up in the IMF, International Monetary Fund. Well, you know what the IMF is, and I know to give a talk at Georgetown University, and to the John Mayne Centre there. And of course, a lot of people turned up because he's in a very important position. And but he spoke about meditation. He spoke about how it helps him with his work. But he made the point. He said, "I don't meditate just because it helps me deal with stress and tension. But I'm a husband and father of 3 teenage children, and so I meditate as a whole person." And he said he meditates at work during the week because it's easier for him, and when he comes home in the evening he likes to be available for the children. So they have a meditation room, I suppose, at the IMF building. So everyone you could see that people were really entranced or really listening deeply to what he was saying, because he was speaking, from a personal place, but not overdoing it, but being very open about it. And so the first question that people asked was, how do you find time to meditate? And he gave the best answer you could imagine. He simply almost shrugged his shoulders and said, well, time isn't the problem. If you want to do something, you do it. Now, if I'd said that as an unemployed, socially useless monk, people would say, well, it's all right for people like him to say meditate twice a day. But to hear somebody with that level of responsibility and stress and family and business and travel and living in the middle of an economic crisis, who says, I want to do it. So what was difficult, and I don't say it's easy, but it certainly has become easier for him. And he comes once a week to meditate at the John Mayne Centre at Georgetown. It's part of his process of supporting his daily practice, his personal practice. So what is difficult becomes easy, Peter says. And we are gradually deified by this knowledge. Gradually deified. Don't forget, this is the goal of life in the Christian vision, is theosis, is deification. This knowledge is not abstract knowledge from outside ourselves, it is experience. And we are changed by our experiences. We're changed by an experience of illness. We're changed by an experience of falling in love. We're changed by the experience of having children or grandchildren. By losing your job or finding a good job. These experiences change us, not just temporarily, but a part of the whole formative process of our lives. And the ultimate goal of this process of transformation is to become God. God became human so that human beings might become God. That's the theological mantra of the early church. Now he comes back to Christ. Remember, he begins by saying that this fourth stage consists in understanding our Lord's incarnation and his manner of life in the world, but understanding it in at this level of spiritual knowledge. We must make Christ our primary goal. We must make Christ our primary goal. Well, that's probably putting it as it is. Remember that Dalai Lama once giving a talk on spiritual practice and strengthening your motivation, and he said when you look at politicians campaigning for an election, they pour themselves into it 24 hours a day. They live and breathe and think the election. And he said if we could put that amount of effort and dedication into our spiritual journey, we'd all be enlightened pretty quickly, and the world would be a better place. It's easier, it seems, or more common, to dedicate ourselves to a primary goal that is external, or seems to be external. It's an ambition, it's a desire for possession or status outside of ourselves. We sort of project ourselves into this imaginary state where we will be Taoiseach or President or CEO or whatever it is. We project ourselves, so I am not here and now, the person I'm concerned in being is over there at the end of the election or at the end of 5 years of training or wherever it is you project yourself into the future. So it's an illusory sense of self, because even when you get there, you still haven't found yourself. You're still not deeply satisfied by it. You know, you look at the newly elected president of the US, I mean, he's at the peak of happiness. You know, he had this great party in the White House, and all the celebrities come, and everybody's singing his praises, and you know, his life is totally fulfilled. You know, 2 weeks later he's begun to realise, you know, he's not as powerful as he thought, and he's got the Congress against him, and the vested interests are all coming in and asking for their piece of the pie, and the politics starts again. Within a year or 2 years, the glamour has worn off quite a lot, and his opinion polls begin to plummet. And so, achieving that goal, not a bad thing to do, but don't put all your eggs in that basket, because it's not going to satisfy us, is it? So we need something to be our primary goal, and that's what Peter is saying here. Then he tells us how we do it. We make Christ our primary goal. How? How do we do that? We do it, he says, through non-attachment. By learning to let go of all the things that we project our true self onto, or all the, as I was saying yesterday, all the positive or negative attachments that we have got caught up in and that trap us. The possessions, negative or positive, that possess us. And that's a breakthrough in understanding how we are meant to live, when we see that this process of detachment is essential for our continued progress. Otherwise we get stuck, and we can get stuck at any point in the journey. We're driving from here to Cork, you know, you get out of Castletown, the road seems completely clear and you can make good time, and then you hit the N22 and you're stuck in slow-moving traffic. So you can get stuck on the journey at any place in the journey, even very close to the end. You can still get stuck. You can get hooked by something, negative or positive. So the sooner we learn this, and this is why I think it's so important to teach children to meditate, because you're teaching them detachment. When they sit to meditate, they are and saying the mantra with attention. For them it's perhaps a kind of a game almost, it's playing rather than praying, but it is praying for them, and they are, whatever it is, they are experiencing the meaning of detachment, taking their attention off the game they were playing, or whatever it is they want to do next, or the next thing they want to eat or drink, or just temporarily even learning to detach. And what we can see in a child, and what perhaps it takes a little longer for us to see in ourselves, is that this is, as the child would say, nice. Do you like meditation? Yes, it's nice. Peaceful. It's calm, relaxing. Yes, I like it. And this is what Peter of Damascus said. What brings more delight than to achieve dispossession? How can you be happier than when you are detached? In the state of detachment, he says, we can accept all that happens to us. And he's got an interesting thing here. What brings more delight than to achieve dispassion, and no longer to be under the sway of anger or the desire for worldly things? Regarding as nothing the things that most people value, and rising above them, we live as in paradise, or rather as in heaven, set free from all constraints through our untroubled devotion to God. Because a person in such a state joyfully accepts all that happens to him, all things bring him repose, rest. Because he loves everyone, everyone loves him. Because he is detached from all things, he rises above them all. Moreover, he has no wish for the things that other people fight about, and which cause them distress when they fail to acquire them, even though they would only be condemned if they did acquire them. This detachment frees an inquisitive person from all sufferings in this present life and in the life to come. So, do you think we can market that? Yeah, we can try. Detachment frees us from suffering. It pulls up passions, these disordered emotions, by their roots. And remember, in his vision, the purpose of this, or the meaning of this, is to make Christ our primary goal. It's person-centered rather than self-centered. Christ is hidden in the Gospels, he says, and he who wishes to find him must first sell all he has and buy the Gospel. So he's using the parable, of course, of the treasure buried in the field. The man who finds the treasure buried in the field, what does he do first of all? He buries it again. He sells everything he has and goes and buys the field. And for sheer joy, sells everything he has and buys the field. So this is the parable that's in Peter's mind at the moment. And with full consciousness, we grasp the significance of the Incarnation. We really begin to get what it means. I grow weak, Lord, before your wonders, and I feel at a loss. I long to take refuge in silence. So this is this deep or clear or spiritual knowledge, which is um, which he describes in ways that are very like the experience of falling in love. It's the feeling of delight, discovery, of connection, of course, finding something that you were looking for, and of being known by it as well. You have filled my soul with every blessing. I dimly perceive your works, and my mind is amazed. Yet the knowledge is not mine, nor the endeavour for it. Nor the endeavour, for it is your grace. So, even in the flush of falling in love, and this is some of the great theologians have come to this conclusion that it is simply coming to this knowledge, or coming to experience Christ in this way is a falling in love. It's not like falling in love. It is falling in love. So what's interesting here, we'll conclude here, is the relationship between this experience that deepens and intensifies if we keep the process of detachment going. The relationship between this experience and the scriptures. What role do the scriptures play in this? And the relationship between this experience and our daily lives, where we have plenty of opportunity to practice detachment every few minutes. If we read the scriptures and reflect on them, as we did yesterday, as we will later today, and I think especially when we share the scriptures, read the scriptures in a small group, as we did, there is a maybe it's easier for us to read it in that way. Certainly it's another way of reading them rather than just sitting on your own and reading. But there is an experience unique to itself of that in sharing the word of God with others in that way, rather than one person taking over and trying to tell everybody how it should be experienced or how it should be understood. There is with a certain amount of self-restraint, but also a certain amount of self-giving. It's a balance between the two in a small group, isn't there? You are actually teaching each other. We are teaching each other, and every person's point of view is in fact right. Nearly always, anyway, unless they're really crazy. But their point of view is valid, certainly valid, but it's not complete in itself. There's more than one point of view on the scriptures, but by coming at it from these multi points of view, we feel a greater knowledge, a greater understanding of the mysteries hidden in the scriptures. That's what you've got to think of it as. And again, think of this idea of hiding. Plato thought that knowledge is innate. We don't really acquire knowledge, but we recall it. Anamnesis is the word. We use the same word to describe the Eucharist, and making present. It's not just remembering, it's a recalling, reconnection to an original knowledge, or to a present moment, we might say, outside or free of time, which is always there, it's always resting there, it's God's presence. But when we are in the right space, at the right time, and tuned in the right way, we recall it. But he says, Plato says, of course, we need midwives to help to bring out this knowledge. And that's what we are to each other, or we could say that is what Christ is for the Christian. It's someone who brings this knowledge out of us that is innate waiting. And he makes, of course, Plato, of course, makes an important distinction between, which is his influence on Christian mysticism too, between knowledge and opinion. You can have an opinion on something and fight for your opinion or impose your opinion, but the knowledge is wisdom, it's understanding, it's the spiritual knowledge we're talking about. So, as we begin to realize that the Holy Scriptures are full of astonishing things, we begin to see things as they are in their true nature. So, this experience of spiritual knowledge, we're still only at the first stage of contemplation. It'd be interesting to see what the 8th stage is like. At this first stage, we are experiencing a change in our lifestyle as we practice detachment. We are discovering the hidden mysteries in the Scriptures. We are developing our motivation, our commitment to our spiritual discipline, and we are understanding the Lord's incarnation. What an overwhelming wonder and mystery there is in that truth. So let's we'll meditate now, and then we'll passengers on this journey into contemplation. But we have to make some effort. We have to want to make the journey. But as soon as we do, we are the beneficiaries of a response that we experience, as Peter says, God's attentive gaze. And it's that gaze which then pulls us forward and pulls us into the next stages. So this morning I'd like to look at the 4th stage of contemplation, which for him is really the beginning of the journey. This is where you've got over your worst problems. You've taken the first step on the 12-step program. You've admitted that you can't do it all by yourself, and you, in that particular case, kick the habit, and you realize that the fellowship and the friendship of others is essential to this, but also grace comes into the equation as well. So it's now that we could say we are really beginning. John Main, in describing the stages of meditation, you could say meditation is the way we accept or receive the gift of contemplation. In the Christian understanding, this process of contemplation, or the vision of God is what it means, is essentially gratuitous. It's not something we acquire through a technique or a massive effort of will, although there's we have to do something about it. There are degrees of perfection, which is why we shouldn't be trapped by perfectionism, because perfectionism thinks that there's only one kind of perfection, and if I can do this and achieve that and master this and control that, then I've become perfect. So that's why perfectionism, in religious people especially, is really counterproductive. It really trips you up. It really blocks the experience of God. This is what Jesus points out many times in his critique of religion, the religion of his own age, but it's inherent in all religious people and institutions, especially this tendency to reduce perfection to something, to one horizon, as it were. So, with the fourth stage of contemplation, the journey of contemplation really begins. Father John says that when we're learning to meditate, it's when, in this way of meditation, when we start listening to the mantra, we can say that meditation is really beginning. Because again, we don't want to take this too literally or in too much of a linear way, but when we begin to meditate, our minds are very scattered. We begin perhaps even with some serious problems, as Peter was describing yesterday. We've fallen into the fallenness of the world, into the fallenness of our own ego, into the darkness, even of serious problems, psychological, psychic problems. So if we begin to meditate in that state, we are going to find it pretty rough at times. I mentioned yesterday the man who meditated for the first time and discovered in a wonderful, immediate and pure way that he has peace and joy in himself. And he wasn't looking for it, he had no idea. He didn't have any demands or expectations, which is perhaps why he found it so quickly. But he just fell into it. And I'm sure it's changed his life. He just discovered that it's there. Perhaps it's going to take him another 20 years to act on it. But when we begin, we are in the early stages. We will find ourselves battling with our restless, distracted minds that are constantly programmed to spin back to ourselves, to some kind of self-centeredness or self-reflection or self-analysis. And the ego system is so deeply ingrained, of course, that it takes a bit of training even to begin to turn the searchlight of consciousness off ourselves. But then he says, so we start saying the mantra with constant interruptions. And then perhaps we notice after some time that we are able... we've been looking at the stages of contemplation as described in the work of quite a large contributor to the Philokalia, Peter of Damascus, probably a 10th or 11th century Eastern Christian monk. And yesterday we looked at the first three stages where he deals with the ascetical aspects of the journey into contemplation. And we saw how we have to face what the Buddhists would call the dukkha, or the unsatisfactoriness, or the fallenness of the world, the fact that things don't always work as we would like them to, in fact very often don't. And at the same time, as we learn to accept that and understand that and not run away from it, we can develop a sense of responsibility, a personal decision arising from a deeper level of volition. It's not just a New Year's resolution which we forget in 5 minutes, but a deeper volition or a deeper change, in fact, within ourselves that allows us to do something about it, to actually set about climbing out of what can, in its worst forms really be a hell, or an experience of isolation and deprivation and lovelessness, so that we can do something about it. And that's the work of faith on our part. A certain amount of effort is needed. We're not passive ourselves, as I said, otherwise we don't get off our chairs. But essentially, this experience manifests grace, something free, something absolutely unconditioned by cause and effect even, and yet it's something we attune ourselves to, something of a paradox, because it might look or sound as if we're twisting God's arm in some way, or we're finding some metaphysical or cosmic technique that's going to make it happen, because we do have to do something. But essentially, the experience itself and even the process itself, because the experience is a process, not just getting to our destination and then unpacking our bags and settling down, as we've all done here this week, but the experience itself is a process. And in the literature, especially of the Eastern Fathers of the Church, we see that it is an infinite process. If we seek God, St. Gregory of Nyssa says, we will find God. Simple as that. Just seek and you will find. But then he says, to find is to seek. When you've found, you've just kind of discovered another infinity, another sphere beyond, another horizon beyond what you thought was your goal. So the seeking leads to finding, that's good news. The finding always opens up into a new boundlessness, a new infinity. So Gregory of Nyssa says there are